Okay, so not too much to cover when it comes to organism ecology. Again, the chapter is called behavioral ecology, but I'll show you why they do that. And I think it kind of makes sense either way. We'll talk about the niche, and then I'll show you some web pages because it's a little bit easier to understand some of that in that form. So. All right, but before we get to any of that, we need to make sure we remember the levels of organization of biology or ecology, right? So we start off, and I always do this with concentric circles, right? Organism ecology is adaptations that are structural and behavioral about an individual organism. What is one level out from that? What is more complicated than organism ecology? What could be more complicated than one yellow jacket? That's a yellow. Two yellow jackets, right? And because that's two of the same species, we call that population ecology, right? You're only dealing with yellow jackets. That's it, nothing else. And so the question we would ask is, why is the yellow jacket population increasing? Why is it decreasing? What's going on with the yellow jacket population? But one level up from that, what could be more complicated than all of the possible yellow jackets? Other organisms, right? And so the things that eat them, birds, the things that they eat, flower pollen, things like that, the things that they compete with, bees. And so we call that the community ecology, and it includes all of the living groups of species that are living in this particular environment that interact together. That includes the yellow jacket population. But what could be more complicated than all of the living species in an area? We have this area, this environment, and we are talking about all of the living things in it. Make it more complicated. What do we need to add in?
Non-living regions.
Well, not just that's going to be later. It's all the non-living things, right? So we got to include one level up from community ecology is what we call ecosystem ecology, where we include the non-living things, the nutrients and the energy that flows through it, and why the energy flows through it in certain ways, what happens to the energy. And I definitely, I start here and I work my way out, and then out, and then out, and then out like that, because I think it makes sense once you start thinking about it. Because the ecosystem ecology includes communities, which includes populations, which includes the organisms. So that's how ecology is kind of like created and formed and taught. But if we talk about behavioral ecology, which I call organism ecology, that means the behavioral and structural adaptations that allow an organism to fill in it. Which one should we say? I feel like I'm just simple and basic, and I say niche, but I think they're actually both accepted. So I don't know. I have always just said niche. So when we talk about behavioral, good. That's why it's called behavioral ecology. But that's ignoring like structural adaptations and the genotype and all that kind of stuff. And so I like to include both of them. So behavior is. I actually have seen some questions on behavior on the AP test. There's been a few about like bees dancing, the bee waggle dance, and how like if a bee finds a flower that has pollen in it, it flies back to the nest and it does this weird waggle dance, and its waggle in relation to the sun is telling the other bees which direction it is, and then its waggle, the length of the waggle tells them how far away it is. It's this really weird thing that they do to communicate, right? That's a behavior. And with behaviors, there are generally three different types of behaviors. There's innate, then there is, actually, I guess there's two. Go back. Innate, and then there is learned. Innate is a lot simpler, right? Because this is something that you're born with, right? So this is born with. And that means that it is built into your DNA and your gene expression, right? And so that's like dogs wagging their tails. They do that as soon as they are born. Horses walking, they stand up and they walk. Humans walking is an innate behavior. Did y'all know that newborns can walk? Really, this is really weird behavior. You take a newborn that is 1 minute old and you hold it up on top of a table and speak to this. Right? And now it can't support itself because we're born really early because of our brain size. We have to be born early or it gets more dangerous. And then as the baby puts on fat, it gets too, like after a few weeks or a few months, it gets too big to do it. And then its muscles have to catch up at around the age of 1, right? And so we're born with this innate walking, but we lose it. And so it certainly is not like anything that a newborn can actually do, but it's in there, it's in their head, it's in our DNA. Learned behaviors, and this gets into some old psychology experiments that you guys might have heard of, right? So we have 2 types of this. There is classical conditioning. And these psychology experiments that like Pavlov did with dogs are, they were designed to like figure out how organisms learn. I always get these 2 confused. Like I'm not a behavioral, ecologist or anything like that. So let's do classical conditioning first. Okay, Pavlov did this. You all know Pavlov's dogs?
No.
So Pavlov paired, he had all these dogs, and he paired a stimulus with a involuntary response, okay? So he feeds the dogs, he rings the bell, and then he measures the saliva production in the dogs, right? And so the dogs are connecting this stimulus, the bell, with saliva production. That's an involuntary response, right? It's not wagging the tail, it's not walking over to the food dish. It is something the dogs cannot control. And it works, right? Because then all of a sudden, if you remove the food from this, if you just ring the bell, the dogs start to produce saliva. And so that's an involuntary response to something that does not connect to it. But it's one way that we can learn, and this is associative learning. And, I lose track of this because, like, he's touching a hot pan and learning that the pan is hot, so I'm not going to do that again. Like, is pain involuntary, or is pain going to be on the operant conditioning side? And I think it fits on the other one. I'm not 100% sure here. But this is one way that more complicated organisms learn, right? We pair these 2 ideas, and then they work together, and so our brain has like repeats those things, even if they're involuntary. That is a little different than what we call operant conditioning. And this one, it is a reward or a punishment. And so do something good and you will get something good in return. If you get an A in your class, I'm going to give you $10, right? That kind of thing. Like that is, I learned to do well in my class because I'm going to get $10. It's not an involuntary response. It is like associated. I don't know. I call it like we're associating these 2 things, but it's put over there. There are all these like technical terms here. But this is reinforcement. So if I throw the ball, my dog brings the ball back, then I say, oh, good boy, and then the dog's going to keep doing that because he wants that to happen. Or I throw the ball and he comes back and I give him a little treat and he keeps doing that. So those are 2 different things, and as a non-behavioral ecologist or behavioral scientist, like I understand they're different. There's 2 different ways that we learn. Like we can connect like rewards so we do them again, or punishments so we don't do those things again, or we can associate things that are unconnected like saliva and a bell. And sometimes they kind of fall apart and breaks, right? That's okay. Now we just think that anything about it. All right, so that is the behavioral side, right? The structural side is different, and that's where we go into. Let me see how I feel. This is more like kind of my side of this, right? So we have, let's say, the genotype producing the phenotype, but the phenotype depends and should match up, and I want to see exactly how I did this, because this is what interacts with the environment, right? Our genotype does not interact with the environment, our phenotype does. And so our phenotype should allow an organism to fill in niche, which we're about to talk about. So let's see if we can come up with a good example in a body system that I don't usually have time to talk about, me which body system it is that we are dealing with. What would that be? You got two of them. I only drew one. In your lower back. So this is one of your kidneys, right? And so the way kidneys work, one, they get a ton of your blood flow. They get a quarter of your blood flow. Incredibly important. And as blood goes to them, it has like a lot of different things in it. It's got water, and so we've got H2O. It's got salt. It's got urea. And so it's got all these things in it, right? And it's really, really easy to filter blood. You basically just push it all out. I'm not going to go into the anatomy of the inside of the kidney, but you just push everything out, and so everything goes out. The water, the salt, and urea, some things that we really need like water, and maybe some salt that we need as well. And then you pull back in the things that you want, like water, right? And so we pull water back in, depending on how much we need. And then we can get rid of that and turn that into urine. Well, how is this going to change in, say, a camel versus maybe a lizard that lives in a rainforest, or even like a fish in a freshwater lake? This arrow right here for a camel. Remember, we filtered everything out. Is that going to be enough to bring back in everything that we need? If we're a camel and live in a desert, we don't have access to a lot of water. So that means camels spend a huge amount of their energy doing this, right? And then when a camel pees, is it highly concentrated urine or is it really dilute urine? Yeah, because they spend a ton of energy bringing all the water back in. I've never seen camel pee, but I assume it's bright yellow, right? Because it has the same kind of urea. But if you have a freshwater fish or a salamander that lives in a rainforest where it's always wet, they don't need to do that, right? They're going to constantly be excreting a whole bunch of really dilute urine, so they're not having to use energy to do, the concentrating process, because they don't need to keep water. They can get water just by going and finding some water anywhere. And so we have these different structural adaptations that allow us to fill a niche. And if you put a camel in a rainforest and it's spending all of this energy to bring the water back in, and there's plenty of water there, and that didn't work. And you take a salamander and put it in a desert, and it's not conserving its water at all, so it's going to die because it's not conserving water and water. So we've got all this. Now, which one of these matches up over there? Is innate or learned more connected to the genotype than the phenotype? No. Yeah, right, because these are things we're born with. That's your DNA. So your innate behavioral responses, of which we humans have a whole bunch of them. We have a grasping reflex, right? You take a newborn, and you hold their hand up, and you do this, and they do that. Why would we have that? Why would humans have this innate grasping reflex? It's a really common way of newborn primates moving around the world, right? They cling on to mom or dad, probably, I don't know, and they hold on to it. And so we still have this stuff built into our brain, right? And we no longer have to do this, but our ancestors, they had to have really strong grasping reflexes. And that is built into our DNA, so it is still there. Getting weaker and weaker over generations, but it still is there. All right. So what about the niche, right? Niche. So there's a bunch of abiotic factors that affect organism distribution. I don't know if this is better starting off on the right-hand side. Let's do the right-hand side first. And we've got this tree. Now you can't imagine it just as a tree. Think of it as like an entire forest, right? And the forest all has these trees. And in these trees, we have little squirrels, right? Right there, regular squirrels. These squirrels are going to eat things that are produced in the trees. And so this entire tree is its potential niche. Right? It has the potential to fill in the entire trees and all of the entire forest. The problem is it never actually does, right? It turns out that only in the middle we have the realized niche. What could explain the difference between the potential niche that it could realize but it doesn't, and why is there this huge amount of space that is an unrealized niche? Why don't they spread out? Why don't they fill up more space and have a higher population? What could explain an unrealized niche?
You can't, hold like that many organisms.
Well, but it can, right? Because like there is space out there. We could fit twice as much because we have this whole amount of space right there. So I'm saying that it can't, but it doesn't. So there must be something external from the squirrels that is preventing them, because they would if they could, but they don't. So what external from the squirrels could prevent them from living in their full potential niche? The little birds. It's harder to draw a bird perching, right? So maybe the birds perch on the exterior of the branches because that's easier for them to live in. And then that means there's no more space, and then they fight and then they don't like each other. And so the reason that organisms don't fully fill in their niche is because of what's called competitive exclusion. Okay, so it turns out that for most cases, no two species can survive in the same or in overlapping niches. They have to have some resource or way of living that is entirely their own, because if not, then they would either outcompete the other species or the other species would outcompete them. And that's just how biology works, right? We always produce with natural selection, the overproduction of offspring, natural selection. But we can explain this and say, okay, the birds are here and the squirrels are here. And it's called competitive exclusion. And it explains why species live where they live, right? There's always like exclusions to that. Is that right? Is there an exclusion to competitive exclusion?
Exception.
An exception to competitive exclusion. And I actually pulled this up. It's a little easier to just put up on the computer. I like this little animation. This is just Wikipedia's competitive exclusion. So this is like a computer model of competitive exclusion with two separate species, right? Red ones and blue ones, and they're doubling and they're increasing in size. And you can watch, it seems like species red takes over, which means species blue can't, right? So species blue cannot continue to survive. And then it kind of shows you right here. And I don't know exactly what the model here is, but it's showing you how they can't survive at the same time. But there's exceptions to this, really weird exceptions to this, and it's the paradox of the plankton, right? The top of the ocean is where plankton live, and you've got zooplankton that are animal-like, and phytoplankton that are plant-like, and you've got mixoplankton that are little animal, little plant, and you've got all kinds of different plankton, right? Well, shouldn't one of them outcompete all the others? Like, why is there on the top of the ocean hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different species of plankton instead of one outcompeting the other one? But they're all using the same resources, right?
There's enough of that.
Oh, it's never enough. These guys would increase and they will they're competing with one another, right? And anytime you have a competition, you've got a winner. And so it should be that there's a winner of plankton. You should have one photosynthetic plankton. You should have one animal-like plankton, and you should have one maybe decomposing plankton like that, right? Competitive exclusion says they shouldn't exist, and yet they do. And the best explanation that we can have is, and I don't know if it's a really good one to do right here, but like from this, is that their abiotic factors are constantly changing, right? Like it's always mixing and it's always moving, and there's always like clouds and not clouds, and then storms and then not storms, and currents that are moving it around to different environments. That's the best explanation that we can come up with for like this paradox, because it should have been competitively excluded to just a handful of species a long time ago. Those things that can change, of course, would be sunlight, right? That would be the water. We could talk about water temperature, water salinity, all kinds of like sources of your water, things like that. Temperature, altitude. These are all things that species are adapted to, that they are used to, and they will fill in that niche as long as there is not something else that outcompetes them from that niche. But if all of these things are constantly changing, then the species that is best is constantly changing, and so they're just flip-flopping and flip-flopping. All right, last up is this. You can take this idea of like a niche and an organism having its realized and unrealized niche, and you can expand it and make it huge with what we call biogeography. And this is also a part of evolution. I think we may have talked about this with evolution. I usually do. So an organism's distribution is affected by geographical features. This shows in like evolutionary time, right? And so first of all, we can look at like just today, and bison. Like, where do bison live?
Yellowstone.
Okay, so and not just there. We got to go back to before like colonial, Americas, and before we killed all of them, right? And so their range was probably something like that, right? Why didn't they spread further north? They're very cold adapted. Yeah, maybe there were things like caribou, right? Maybe there were things like elk that were up here, right? So they were excluded from right there. Why didn't they spread further to the west? I know. Because they're not always excluded by living things. They can be excluded by abiotic factors. What abiotic factors would really hurt a large prairie organism from spreading further to the west? Yeah. So there's the Rocky Mountains, right? And they can't live up there. They can live where it's cold, but they need prairies with grasses and not like a little tiny meadow in the middle of the valley, right? They need big prairies. And the same thing goes with the rivers over here, right? They can't really cross that giant river, and then down here it's too hot and dry, right? So bison live where they live because they evolved to live there, and they didn't spread anywhere else because they didn't have adaptations that allowed them to live somewhere else, like in mountains or across rivers where it's hot. And then caribou and elk were better adapted further to the north. And so, in the absence of human impact, every organism lives where it lives because that's the way it evolved. Unless the whole evolution thing, the world is always changing. So if you look at this with like evolutionary time as well, you can figure out like through time, down here, we have llamas, right? They live in South America, alpacas and llamas and all that kind of stuff. What's their closest relative? A long-necked, tall-hoofed mammal. Not that long.
Oh,
That's still a llama. I can do it. Longer neck than that, and larger than that. They're all the way over here. They're over here, and they're over here. Camels. Right? Because they're super similar. Long neck, little hump. They're very like dry, weather adapted because it's really dry down in South America, in certain areas, and it's really dry over where they are, right? Well, how are their closest relatives on the opposite side of the world? Shouldn't their closest relatives have been like closer to them? It used to be connected, but that would explain like a few things. If we had like camels right here, but we don't have camels right here, right? Because that would connect to right there. But you're on the right track, because that explains a large portion of like evolutionary biogeography. What happened to species A, B, C, D, E, F, and G that would have connected them? They went extinct. 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 They went extinct, and they went extinct, right? And so now these two closest relatives are, now there's another one, there's the two-humped camel is up here as well. You know, the cold adapted two-humped camel, other than the hot adapted one-humped camel, but still, they're all just camels. And so biogeography explains why they live where they live, but if you have to look at evolutionary time, it can get a little bit confusing sometimes. That, I believe, is all of it. See, organism ecology is not very difficult. I think the idea of competitive exclusion is probably a big part of this, along with this little bit on learning. So I haven't assigned the thing yet, the learning part. I'm going to do it right now so that you guys can get started on it. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, I'm going to assign the Learn Smart. I believe it's chapter 43. It's whichever one they have called behavioral ecology.